I'd like to begin tonight by sharing a study that I ran across, I think in New York Times, and the title is "Why Can Some Kids Handle Pressure While Others Fall Apart?" And then it says, scientists think bouts of panic in stressful situations can be traced to genetics, but don't freak out, biology is not necessarily destiny. And it's a really fascinating study about how all of us have a certain genetic combo that determines whether we are what's called worriers, which mean that we have a lot of cognitive clarity a lot of the time, but come a stressful situation, we freeze and we really perform poorly in those instances. And others are warriors that might not have the same clarity when there's no stress, but when there is stress, everything falls aside and they're right on it. And a lot of us are somewhere on a spectrum. But the point of the study is that how we respond to stress really has a very clear genetic determination, which means it's not our fault. It really is not our fault. And yet how many kids have tests in school be one of the main formative experiences that creates low self-esteem? I mean, it's one of the great tragedies in not understanding how we respond to a competitive educational system, and it's beyond education. It's like we all experience stressful situations, and how we respond is driven by genetics. So that's one piece that it says. But the other piece is that there are ways of relating to the stress that can turn someone who's a worrier into someone that's actually able to handle it. So it's kind of two messages, which is it's genetically determined, and how you relate to it can shift your neurobiology around. Okay? Now, the reason I got really interested is because I see so much of the suffering that we have come down to two basic beliefs, and one is what's happening is bad, it's wrong. In other words, the stress that's happening is a bad thing, and I'm wrong in the way I'm dealing with things. And if we're moving through life with some combo of these two beliefs, that things are wrong and I'm wrong, we're going to suffer. And maybe just pause right here and ask you to take a moment and sense anywhere in your life where you know you're getting a bit caught or stuck. And if you've got somewhere where there's a lot of suffering, just take a moment to close your eyes and sense that situation. It might be in relationship with someone. It might be at work. It might be something to do with your health. It might be to do with an addiction. And ask yourself, when I'm in the thick of this, what am I believing? What am I believing about life? And what am I believing about myself? What am I believing about others? If we really investigate, if there's suffering, it means we're believing something's wrong. And it's usually with me or with you or with life. But we often don't, when we're stuck, we often don't pause and really investigate, because we are rigged when we're stuck to actually do anything we can to get away from the unpleasant feelings. We try to fix it, or we try to figure it out, or we obsess, or we numb, or we do other things. And we also carry around a lot of rationalizations for how come things are the way they are and how come we're relating as we're relating. Cartoon has two sheep in very deep conversation. And one saying, sure, I follow the herd, not out of brainless obedience, mind you, but out of a deep and abiding respect for the concept of community. You know? So we have our ideas. But the reality is, if we're stuck, we're believing something that's not true. We're holding on to some partial truth. We're believing something that isn't true, no matter how true it feels. And a story I sometimes go to, because it's so powerful, is of an older man who's a smoker. He's a lifetime smoker. Now he's hospitalized with emphysema. And after a series of small strokes, his daughter is trying to convince him to give up smoking, but he refuses. Not only that, he says, buy me some more cigarettes. And he said, look, I'm a smoker this lifetime. That's how it is. But several days later, he had another stroke, and apparently it did in a part of one of the memory centers in his brain, and without concern, the next day he woke up and he stopped smoking. It wasn't because he decided to. He woke up one morning and he forgot that he was a smoker. You know, to the extent that we're identified with our story about who we are, we're hooked on all the thoughts and behaviors and feelings that go around that story. So beliefs aren't just an idea in our mind. They're very rooted in feelings in our body, and they feel true. If it was really easy to go, oh, this is just a belief, I'm thinking I'm a smoker, you know, I'm going to let go of that now, it would be great, but it's not like that. They're deeply rooted, but they're very workable. And again, this is the gift of what scientists call neuroplasticity, that if we train our attention, we can literally loosen the grip of beliefs that have absolutely shaped a lifetime of suffering. That's the possibility. So I want to read you Hildegard of Bingen, who's one of the great Christian mystics. We cannot live in a world that is not our own, in a world that is interpreted for us by others. An interpreted world is not a home. An interpreted world is not a home. Part of the terror is to take back our own listening, to use our own voice, to see our own light. An interpreted world is not home. When I read that, I found that languaging really powerful. An interpreted world is not home. To me, it means a world filtered through beliefs. Beliefs that are shaped by our culture, shaped by others, internalized by us, and we don't get born with the beliefs. Beliefs about what's right or wrong, good and bad. If we're moving through our day and our experience is filtered through beliefs that say, this is wrong, this is bad, this shouldn't be happening, I shouldn't act like this, you shouldn't act like that, then we're going to contract and be living in a place that is not our fullness, it's not home. So I love it for a mystic, because the idea of an interpreted world, for Hildegard, it meant, that there's not intermediaries that are going to say, here's how the kingdom of God works and here's where you fit in. What she's saying is the terror, because it's absolutely a dying to our whole idea of a small self, is to say direct experience. That I'm going to trust what I directly contact. This is the way of a mystic. And in the Buddhist tradition, the term ehipassiko, and the Buddha said, okay, I'm giving you all this dharma, but don't take my word for it. In fact, if you try to take my word for it, it won't work. Ehipassiko means come and see for yourself. Step outside the interpreted world, including what you call your own interpretations, Step outside the beliefs that keep you small, that keep you away from realizing the love and the awareness that you're home. Step outside of those beliefs. Ehi passiko, come see for yourself. So Hildegard then points the way back. How do you do that? And how do we live true to ourselves, our real selves? And she says, really, take back your own listening. Listen to what's really here in the moment. I think of that as, challenging the beliefs, inquiring and saying, what's really real? And then listening deeply. She says, take back our own listening. And then use our own voice. Then from that presence, express authentically what we are. Don't hold it back. And then, of course, see your own light. Recognize the formless, the sacred that's living through each of us. So tonight we're going to kind of deepen an inquiry into what does it really mean to awaken beyond the interpreted world, beyond this conceptual world. And so just to look a little more closely at, with the lens of Buddhist psychology, all thoughts and beliefs are made of sound bites and images going on in the brain. And they are, at most, a representation of reality. They're not it. They're just like a movie is not what the movie's about. I mean, in the real world, this movie in our mind, these little flickering sound bits and comments and images are not reality. Sometimes they're a useful representation, and they guide us and they help us know how to navigate. And often they turn into a story that keeps us from home. Okay, so that's piece number one. And the given is that these thought forms will keep on percolating. That this is, I usually say it, that just like the body secretes enzymes, these, we just keep on having these thought forms. And they're not only a given, they're probably the most central strong tool in our evolutionary survival kit. So they matter a lot to us. They promote survival. Next piece, okay, so they're a given, they're for survival. The next piece is they have a negative bias, which I think you've heard a lot probably by now. That we know that over the tens of thousands of years, it was way more to our advantage to remember danger. So we tracked it when there were sounds and fear associated with a slither or associated with a certain crunch around us or whatever, of wildcat paws. That got recorded in the traces in our memory, not the moments of savoring the warm sun, lying on a rock and just sunbathing. It wasn't like that. So savor was not to our evolutionary advantage. So depending on our genetics and culture and personal history, still we have this negative bias that is completely, affects our day-to-day filtering of experience. A linguistics professor was lecturing his class one day. In English, he said, 2 negatives make a positive. He continued, he said, but in some languages, for instance Russian, 2 negatives still remain a negative. However, he pointed out, there's no language wherein 2 positives make a negative. A voice from the back piped up, yeah, right. So back to Buddhist psychology, we don't experience these representations as representations. They're primarily fear-based, or they lean towards fear-based, and we think they're reality. So that's what our nervous system is moving through day by day. We're filtering in our world in a way that has our body have this ongoing churning sense of restlessness when it's not a big deal, unease, anxiety, fear, terror. Okay, so that's what goes on. And then what happens, for each of us in our own ways, is that there's a looping that goes on whereby we have these fear-based beliefs, and they take an experience, and then we feel, the result of it emotionally, either anger or depression or whatever it is. And then that feeling has us act in certain ways that then confirms the belief. So when I describe that looping of we have a belief and then it creates behaviors which then confirm the belief, does that resonate for you? Okay, so we know that one. We know how it goes, that if we believe another's going to reject us, that insecurity has us behave in ways that push others away, right? Or if we believe that others are out for themselves, that they're defensive or selfish, then we're going to act ways, our behaviors are actually going to provoke that very experience. So we loop in a kind of trance, whereby we have these beliefs, and as it said, the beliefs create the thoughts create the emotions generate the behaviors end up creating our destiny, is the way Gandhi put it. If we didn't have those fear-based beliefs, an emotion might get triggered off naturally. You might get fear come up because you're told an upcoming job performance you had to prepare for. And the natural length of a fear kind of comes and goes is 1.5 minutes, according to some neuroscientists. What keeps it going? How come most of us do not just have it as 1.5 minutes? So we have an ongoing play of thoughts that come from these beliefs that just keep fueling it and fueling it and fueling it. So it becomes a mood. Basically what we're doing is we're adding on to an experience the interpretation of, this is a bad situation, and even a deeper, I'm going to fail. So that those beliefs, that interpretation, this is bad, I'm going to fail, is the linchpin that holds our trance together. Does that make sense? That's behind the lines. Now what happens is that we get identified with the self that's having a bad experience and is failing. That's the core mechanism of that Buddhist psychology describes as what keeps us hooked. We get identified. That's me. That's the experience. So we're identified with what often is described as an unreal self. We have a story in our mind about a self that's falling short, that's victimized, or that's oppressing others, or whatever it is. We have a narrowed sense of identity with an unreal self. And, of course, when there's an unreal self, there's also an unreal other, right? Okay, so let me anchor this a little for you. The story that came up that I thought I'd share with you of a man I worked with who had taken MBSR, mindfulness-based stress reduction. So he was beginning to practice to work with his anxiety and depression and so on. He was a professor at college. His wife initiated a very painful divorce process. She had found intimacy elsewhere. His tendency to be depressed and unavailable in some way was supposedly the cause. And the belief that he was living with was, eventually people will always leave me. I'll always be abandoned, and it's because I'm not worthy. People don't want to be close to me. They won't really like me if they are. So that was his interpreted worldview and his unreal self he was identified with. And then, of course, he had all the behaviors built around that, which was he very much relied on a very good intellect and, performed really well in terms of his work. A lot of kudos for that. Competitive athlete, although he was very out of touch with his body and, of course, out of touch with his feelings. So he was pretty unconnected internally and pretty solidified in that unreal self. But the divorce cracked him open, and I'm going to return to how we worked together with his interpretations in a bit. But the divorce did crack him open, and that gave him an opportunity to deepen his attention. to kind of start contacting what the unlived life you've been running from. So before I kind of go over the process of deconstructing that interpreted reality, how we come home again, I just want to say that in the same way that we have narrowed sense of who we are, it's exactly the same with the world. If we're subscribing to a story of what's wrong with me, then the world is out there and we're filtering in the same kind of way. There's going to be a lack of trust. Others are going to be, what I do think the term is so good, unreal others. They're kind of two-dimensional characters. And the more stressed we are, the more there's a self in here, and others are kind of out there, and they're either somebody we want something from, an object that we're trying to get something from, or somebody that we want to kind of push away and don't want to be near, or else if they're neutral, we ignore them. But that's the play. When somebody's an unreal other, we can't sense their humanness, and they become kind of an object to control or ignore. And as illustration, a story some of you might remember of at one university, a Catholic priest and a Baptist preacher and a rabbi were all chaplains in the same very large university. And they were friends, but they were also rather competitive in their own way, and to see who has the true path. And they decided, they set up a competition for themselves, which was whoever really has the true path, the way, would be able to convert a bear. Okay, so one thing led to another. They decided to do an experiment. They all would go out into the woods, find a bear, preach to it, and attempt to convert it. So they did this. They dispersed. 7 days later, they all came together to discuss their experiences. Here goes. Father Flannery, who had his arm in a sling, was on crutches when first. Well, he said, I went into the woods to find me a bear, and when I found him, I began to read to him the catechism. Well, that bear wanted nothing to do with me and began to slap me around. So I quickly grabbed my holy water, sprinkled him, and Holy Mary, Mother of God, he became gentle as a lamb. The bishop's coming out next week to give him First Communion and confirmation. Reverend Billy Bob spoke next. He was in a wheelchair and had one arm and both legs in casts. In his best fire and brimstone oratory, he claimed, well, brothers, you know we don't sprinkle. I went out and I found me a bear, and then I went and read to my bear from God's holy word. But that bear wanted nothing to do with me, so I took hold of him, and we began to wrestle. We wrestled down one hill and up another and down another till we came to a creek. So I quickly dunked him and baptized his hairy soul. And just like you said, he became gentle as a lamb. We spent the rest of the day praising Jesus. Hallelujah. The priest and the reverend both looked down at the rabbi, who was lying in a hospital bed. He was in a body cast and traction with IVs and monitors running in and out of him. He was in really bad shape. The rabbi looked up and said, well, looking back on it, circumcision might not have been the best way to start. So we're talking about unreal others here. And even though the bear's a fun example, when we live in our idea of who the other is, in other words, how things should be, we're not really paying attention. And we go around with ideas about each other. And we don't often check in and really find out who's there. So a lot of moments, it's an unreal other, and when there's an unreal other, it's very easy to dehumanize. And that's where we really see in our society, in our world, and through history, the huge amount of violence and injustice. Because especially when we don't know people, they truly become a story, and it's very hard for our body and our heart to get these beings are real. Instead, we have a category for them. And the category is often a collective agreement of a word that's demeaning, that makes the other sound less human. We have ideas in our minds that, that are beliefs about what is superior and inferior in terms of religion. We have racial beliefs that put people down, gender, sexual orientation, and all sorts of other ones. I was thinking about the body shape and how many of us have in our mind what should be, and how much violence and cruelty to ourselves and to others come from our ideas about body shape. I was thinking about this, and then I read, again, New York Times, this time it's a magazine. Some of you might have seen this, knowing about the epidemic of obesity. There was an effort in the food industry to work with the food industry to create products that wouldn't addict people to that perfect balance of sugar and fat that keeps the brain thinking it has to have more of that thing. What's happened over the decades is that the food industry has used science to discover how to addict people to food that creates obesity. So they tried to have these meetings, high-level meetings, and this is a few years ago, and this article in the New York Times shows how not only were the leaders of the food industry not willing to go along, they just considered it like, look, this is our way of making profit. I mean, it's just like the cigarettes, it's like addicting people to nicotine's my way of making profit. So they were unwilling, and it's an interesting article. But I bring it up because what would make one put their time and energy into something that is creating so much suffering in the world? Why would somebody build weapons? Why would somebody go to war? Unless, and this is the bottom line, there's an interpreted world where the other's not real, and there's fear, which leads to a need to consume more, have power over, or destroy. So what I'm saying is, living in an interpreted world that's fear-based keeps on fueling war. War against ourselves and war against others. This is Kurt Vonnegut, and in his novel there's a man that's watching television, and he's watching a movie from World War II. All those endless black and white movies from World War II. But someone put the reel on backwards. So he's there and he's sitting, and this is how it looks to him. American planes full of holes and wounded men and corpses take off backwards from an airfield in England. Over France, a few German fighter planes flew at them backwards and sucked bullets and shell fragments from some of the planes and crewmen. They did the same for the wrecked American bombers on the ground, and those planes flew up backwards to join the formation. The formation flew backwards over a German city that was in flames. The bombers opened their bomb bay doors, exerted miraculous magnetism which shrunk the fires, gathered them into cylindrical steel containers, and lifted the containers by magic into bellies of the planes. The containers were stored neatly in racks. But there were still a few wounded Americans, though, and some of the bombers were in bad repair. Over France, though, German fighters came up again and made everything and everybody as good as new. When the bombers got back to their base, the steel cylinders were taken from their racks and shipped back to the United States, where factories were operating day and night, dismantling the cylinders, separating the dangerous contents into minerals. Touchingly, it was mainly women who did this work. The minerals were then shipped to specialists in remote areas. It was their business to put them into the ground and hide them cleverly so they would never hurt anybody ever again.